Welcome, traveler of time, to tonight's gentle descent into the quiet corners of history. Whether you're resting after a long day, or simply seeking a moment of calm, I'm grateful to have you here. Do let me know where you're listening from and what hour it is for you. I imagine us as glowing dots on a spinning globe connected by curiosity and the hush of night. And if this peaceful storytelling brings a little stillness to your day, feel free to subscribe. We'll have many more historical tales to share. In this video, I'm going to take you inside the actual daily routine of a medieval king, and I'm talking about the real stuff that historians have pieced together from court records, royal chronicles, and surviving documents. We're going to explore what these rulers did from the moment they opened their eyes until they went to sleep. And, trust me, it's going to completely change how you think about medieval royalty. But before we dive into the nitty-gritty details, let me give you some context that will blow your mind. Most people think being a medieval king meant unlimited power and endless luxury. But the reality is that these rulers were under constant pressure from threats that could literally end their reign overnight. They had to balance the demands of powerful nobles who could rebel at any moment, manage complex relationships with the church, deal with foreign invasions, handle economic crises, and somehow keep millions of people fed and protected, all while knowing that one wrong move could result in assassination, rebellion, or complete political collapse. And here's what makes this even more fascinating. I've spent months researching court documents, royal household records, and surviving schedules from actual medieval kings. And what I discovered will completely change how you see medieval power. These weren't just ceremonial figureheads. They were working 16-hour days, making life and death decisions, and managing empires that spanned thousands of miles. The level of multitasking and political skill required was absolutely insane. So, what exactly did a day in the life of a medieval king look like? Well, it turns out their schedules were packed tighter than a modern CEO's calendar. Let's start with the morning, because this is where things get really interesting. Picture this. It's dawn in a medieval castle. And while most of the kingdom is still asleep, the king is already being woken up by his personal attendants. But this isn't just a simple wake-up call. The morning routine of a medieval king was a carefully choreographed political performance that set the tone for the entire day. First, the king would be dressed by his personal valet. And this wasn't just about putting on clothes. Every piece of clothing, every accessory, every color choice was a political statement. The fabrics had to demonstrate wealth and power. The colors had to send the right message to whatever political situation was happening that day. Even his choice of crown or circlet was strategic because different occasions required different levels of royal display. But here's where it gets really fascinating. While the king was being dressed, he was already conducting business. His closest advisors would brief him on overnight developments, urgent messages that had arrived, and any crises that needed immediate attention. Imagine trying to make important political decisions while someone is literally putting your pants on for you. That was just a normal Tuesday morning for a medieval king. Next came morning prayers. And this wasn't optional. Medieval kings ruled by divine right, which meant they claimed their authority came directly from God. So attending morning mass wasn't just about personal faith. It was about maintaining their entire basis for power. The king had to be seen as pious and blessed by God, because if people started questioning his divine mandate, his entire kingdom could fall apart. But even during prayers, the king's mind was on politics. The chapel was often filled with important nobles, church officials, and foreign ambassadors, all watching the king's every move. His behavior during mass, who he spoke to afterward, even where he sat. All of this was being analyzed and interpreted for political meaning. After morning prayers came one of the most important parts of the king's day, something that most people don't know about. It was called the morning audience, and it was essentially office hours for the most powerful person in the kingdom. Lords, bishops, merchants, foreign diplomats, and sometimes even common citizens would line up for a chance to speak directly with the king about their problems, requests, or important news. This is where the king's political skills really had to shine. He might hear a report about Viking raids on the northern border, followed by a complaint from merchants about unfair taxes, followed by a marriage proposal from a foreign princess, followed by a dispute between two powerful nobles, who were threatening to go to war with each other. And the king had to listen to all of this, remember the details, make decisions on the spot, and somehow keep everyone happy enough that they wouldn't rebel against him. But the morning audience wasn't just about listening to problems. It was also a crucial intelligence-gathering operation. The king needed to know what was happening in every corner of his kingdom, what his enemies were planning, what his allies were thinking, and what the common people were saying about his rule. These morning meetings were how he stayed informed about threats and opportunities that could affect his reign. Oh, now, let's talk about something that might surprise you. Medieval kings were constantly traveling. I'm not talking about occasional trips to other castles. I'm talking about spending months at a time on the road, moving from town to town, castle to castle, constantly on the move, with their entire court following behind them. Why did they do this? Well, it turns out that being seen was absolutely critical to medieval kingship. In an age before mass communication, the only way for a king to maintain control over his territory was to physically show up and remind people that he existed. If a king stayed in one place too long, distant parts of his kingdom might start to forget about him, and local lords might start getting ideas about independence. So, the king's traveling schedule was incredibly demanding. He might spend 2 weeks at his castle in London, then travel for 3 days to reach a castle in the north, spend a week there handling local disputes and meeting with regional nobles, then travel south to deal with problems on the coast, then head west to check on the Welsh borders, all while carrying the entire apparatus of government with him. And when I say the entire apparatus of government, I mean it. The royal household that traveled with the king included hundreds of people. There were personal servants, bodyguards, clerks, scribes, cooks, stable hands, musicians, priests, and dozens of government officials. They had to transport furniture, clothing, documents, weapons, food, and even the king's bed from castle to castle. It was like moving a small city every few days. But here's what makes this even more impressive. While the king was constantly traveling, he still had to keep running the government. Legal documents needed to be signed, tax collection had to be supervised, military campaigns had to be planned, and diplomatic correspondence had to be maintained. All of this had to happen while bouncing around on horseback on medieval roads that were basically just muddy tracks. This brings us to one of the most important aspects of a medieval king's daily life. Something that consumed hours every single day. Paperwork. Yes, you heard that right. Medieval kings spent enormous amounts of time on administrative tasks that would make a modern bureaucrat's head spin. Every land grant had to be personally approved by the king. Every major tax collection needed royal authorization. Every important legal case required the king's attention. Every military appointment had to be signed off on. Every diplomatic treaty needed the royal seal. The amount of documents that crossed a medieval king's desk every single day was absolutely staggering. But it wasn't just about signing papers. The king had to actually understand what he was signing, because making the wrong decision could have catastrophic consequences. Grant land to the wrong person, and you might accidentally strengthen a potential rebel. Approve the wrong tax policy, and you might trigger a peasant uprising. Make the wrong military appointment, and you might lose an entire army. So kings had to be incredibly well informed about law, economics, military strategy, and international politics. They needed to understand the complex web of relationships between different noble families, the strategic importance of different territories, the economic value of different trade routes, and the military capabilities of both their allies and their enemies. This is why medieval kings typically had teams of highly educated advisors. But even with expert help, the final decisions always came down to the king himself. And remember, these weren't abstract policy decisions. These were choices that could literally determine whether the kingdom survived or fell apart. Now, let's talk about something that might shock you about medieval kings. They were constantly under physical threat. I'm not just talking about the occasional assassination attempt or foreign invasion. I'm talking about living every single day knowing that there were people actively plotting to kill them, overthrow them, or destroy everything they had built. Medieval politics was incredibly violent. Kings who showed weakness were quickly eliminated by stronger rivals. Kings who made enemies of powerful nobles often found themselves facing armed rebellions. Kings who failed to defend their territory were conquered by foreign armies, and kings who lost the support of their people sometimes faced popular uprisings that could end with them being dragged from their castle and executed in the town square. This constant threat of violence shaped every aspect of a medieval king's daily routine. He couldn't travel anywhere without a heavily armed escort. He couldn't eat food that hadn't been tested for poison. He couldn't sleep in a room that hadn't been secured by his bodyguards. Even his most trusted advisors were potential threats, because anyone with access to the king was also in a position to betray him. But here's what's really fascinating about this. Despite living under constant threat, medieval kings couldn't afford to appear afraid or paranoid. Showing fear was a sign of weakness, and weakness was an invitation for enemies to attack. So, kings had to project confidence and strength, even when they knew there were daggers pointed at them from every direction. This created an incredible psychological pressure that modern leaders can barely imagine. Every public appearance was a performance where the king had to convince everyone watching that he was powerful, confident, and completely in control, even if he was actually terrified that someone in the crowd might try to kill him. The stress of this lifestyle was enormous, and it shows up in historical records. Many medieval kings died young from what we would now recognize as stress-related illnesses. Others developed what appeared to be anxiety disorders or paranoid tendencies. Some turned to alcohol or other substances to cope with the pressure, and quite a few simply cracked under the strain and made increasingly erratic decisions that eventually led to their downfall. But the kings who survived and thrived were the ones who learned to manage this pressure, while still making the thousands of complex decisions required to run a medieval kingdom. They had to be simultaneously paranoid enough to stay alive and confident enough to lead effectively. It was an almost impossible balancing act, and the fact that any of them managed to pull it off for decades at a time is honestly amazing. Speaking of making complex decisions, let's dive into one of the most demanding aspects of medieval kingship: military leadership. Because when we think about medieval kings, we often picture them leading charges into battle. But the reality of royal military responsibilities was far more complex and demanding than Hollywood would have you believe. First of all, medieval kings weren't just military commanders who showed up for the big battles. They were essentially running a complex military-industrial operation that never stopped. Think about it this way. The king had to maintain standing armies, manage castle defenses, coordinate supply lines, negotiate with mercenary companies, and plan military campaigns that could last for months or even years. But here's where it gets really complicated. Medieval armies weren't like modern military forces with clear command structures and professional soldiers. Instead, they were chaotic collections of different groups with competing loyalties and interests. You had knights who owed military service to the king, but who also had their own lands and political agendas. You had mercenary companies who fought for whoever paid them the most. You had peasant levies who were forced to serve, but had no military training, and just wanted to go home to their farms. Managing these different factions required incredible diplomatic skill. The king had to keep his knights happy by giving them opportunities for glory and plunder. He had to pay his mercenaries enough that they wouldn't switch sides in the middle of a campaign. He had to motivate his peasant soldiers without pushing them so hard that they deserted en masse. And he had to do all of this while actually winning battles against enemies who were trying to kill him and destroy his kingdom. The logistics alone were mind-boggling. Medieval armies needed enormous amounts of food, water, weapons, armor, horses, and medical supplies. But there were no supply trucks or military logistics companies. Everything had to be organized by the king's household staff, transported by wagon trains that moved at walking speed, and distributed to thousands of soldiers who were scattered across miles of countryside. And the king wasn't just responsible for supplying his own forces. He also had to think about denying supplies to his enemies. This meant controlling key bridges, roads, and river crossings. It meant securing food stores and preventing enemy raids on his territory. It meant maintaining intelligence networks to track enemy movements and plans. But perhaps the most stressful part of military leadership was making life-and-death tactical decisions in the middle of actual battles. When arrows are flying and men are dying all around you, the king still had to stay calm, assess the situation, and give orders that could determine whether his entire army lived or died. Medieval battles were incredibly chaotic and confusing. There were no radios or modern communication systems. Once the fighting started, the king might lose contact with parts of his army and have no idea what was happening on different parts of the battlefield. He had to make split-second decisions based on incomplete information, knowing that the wrong choice could result in total defeat and the destruction of his kingdom. And here's something that really shows how demanding medieval kingship was. Kings who were bad at military leadership didn't just lose battles. They lost everything. Their kingdoms were conquered. Their families were killed or exiled, and they themselves were often executed by their victorious enemies. This created enormous pressure to constantly improve military skills and stay ahead of evolving battlefield tactics. Kings had to study the latest developments in weapons technology, fortification design, and combat strategies. They had to train regularly to maintain their personal fighting skills, and they had to build relationships with the best military minds of their time to get advice on complex strategic problems. But military leadership was just one part of the king's responsibilities. Let's talk about something that might surprise you even more. Medieval kings spent huge amounts of time on what we would now call economic policy and business management. You see, running a medieval kingdom was essentially like running a massive corporation with thousands of employees and complex revenue streams. The king had to manage royal estates that produced agricultural goods. He had to oversee mining operations that extracted valuable metals and minerals. He had to regulate trade routes and collect customs duties from merchants. He had to manage royal workshops that produced everything from weapons to luxury goods. But it wasn't just about making money. The king also had to think about economic strategy and long-term planning. Which industries should he invest in to strengthen his kingdom? Which trade partnerships would be most beneficial? How could he encourage economic growth while still maintaining political control? Medieval kings were constantly making decisions that sound like modern business problems. Should he raise taxes to fund a military campaign, even if it might hurt economic growth? Should he devalue the currency to make exports more competitive? Should he grant trading privileges to foreign merchants, or would that hurt domestic businesses? And just like modern business leaders, kings had to deal with economic crises that could threaten everything they had built. Crop failures could lead to famine and social unrest. Trade wars could disrupt vital revenue streams. Currency manipulation by rival kingdoms could destabilize the entire economy. The king's economic decisions affected millions of people, and getting them wrong could trigger rebellions, invasions, or complete social collapse. So medieval kings had to become experts in agriculture, manufacturing, international trade, monetary policy, and dozens of other economic specialties. But here's what makes this even more impressive. Medieval kings had to manage all of these economic responsibilities without modern tools like statistical analysis, economic forecasting, or even basic accounting systems. They had to rely on their personal judgment, advice from trusted experts, and whatever information they could gather from traveling merchants and diplomatic contacts. Now, let's dive into something that consumed enormous amounts of the king's time and energy: legal responsibilities. Because medieval kings weren't just political and military leaders, they were also the ultimate judges and legal authorities for their entire kingdoms. This meant that the most complex, important, and controversial legal cases eventually made their way to the king's personal attention. Disputes between powerful nobles that could lead to civil war, accusations of treason against high-ranking officials, property disputes that involved vast amounts of land and wealth, criminal cases where the punishment could be death or exile. The king had to hear evidence, question witnesses, consult with legal experts, and make final decisions that everyone would accept as binding. But these weren't just abstract legal puzzles. These were cases where the king's judgment could determine whether someone lived or died, whether families kept their ancestral lands, whether political alliances survived or collapsed. And medieval law was incredibly complex. There were different legal systems for different classes of people. Church law governs certain types of cases. Local customs and traditions had to be respected. International treaties created additional legal obligations. The king had to understand all of these different legal frameworks and figure out how to apply them fairly while still maintaining his own political interests. But legal decision-making was just part of the king's judicial responsibilities. He also had to maintain the entire court system that administered justice throughout his kingdom. This meant appointing judges, overseeing court procedures, ensuring that legal decisions were enforced, and handling appeals from lower courts. Medieval justice was often harsh and violent, but it had to be effective enough to maintain social order. The king had to balance being tough enough to deter crime with being fair enough to maintain popular support. Too lenient, and criminals would think they could get away with anything. Too harsh, and people would see him as a tyrant who couldn't be trusted. This brings us to one of the most demanding aspects of medieval kingship: diplomatic relations with other kingdoms, the church, and powerful internal factions. Because medieval politics was like playing three-dimensional chess while blindfolded. With the stakes being the survival of your entire kingdom, kings had to maintain complex relationships with dozens of different political actors, each with their own interests, capabilities, and potential for causing trouble. Foreign rulers who might be allies today and enemies tomorrow. Church officials who claimed authority that sometimes conflicted with royal power. Powerful nobles who controlled their own armies and territories. Merchant guilds that controlled vital economic resources. Every conversation, every letter, every diplomatic meeting was a high-stakes negotiation where the wrong word could trigger a crisis. Kings had to be incredibly skilled at reading people, understanding hidden agendas, and finding ways to get what they wanted without making unnecessary enemies. But diplomatic skill wasn't just about personal charm or negotiating ability. Kings also had to understand the complex web of relationships between different political actors. Who was allied with whom? What were each faction's strengths and weaknesses? How would different groups react to various policy decisions? This required maintaining extensive intelligence networks and spending huge amounts of time analyzing political information. The king needed to know what foreign rulers were planning, what his own nobles were thinking, what the church hierarchy was discussing, and what ordinary people were saying about his government. And all of this political maneuvering had to happen while the king was simultaneously managing military campaigns, economic crisis, legal disputes, and the hundreds of other daily responsibilities that came with running a medieval kingdom. It's honestly amazing that anyone could handle this level of complexity and pressure without completely losing their minds. But the kings who survived and prospered were the ones who developed systems and skills that allowed them to juggle all of these different responsibilities effectively. They built trusted teams of advisors and administrators. They created efficient procedures for handling routine decisions. They learned to prioritize the most important problems and delegate less critical tasks to subordinates. Most importantly, they understood that being a medieval king wasn't just about having power. It was about using that power effectively to solve problems, protect their people, and build something that would last beyond their own lifetime. The kings who forgot this lesson usually didn't stay kings for very long. Now, here's something that will absolutely blow your mind about medieval kingship: the sheer amount of ceremony and ritual that these rulers had to participate in every single day. We're not talking about the occasional grand coronation or royal wedding that you see in movies. I'm talking about dozens of formal ceremonies, rituals, and symbolic performances that happened constantly throughout the year. Think about it this way. Medieval people believed that the king's authority came directly from God, but that divine connection had to be constantly reinforced through elaborate public displays. The king couldn't just sit in his castle and expect people to remember that. He was divinely appointed. He had to prove it over and over again through carefully choreographed ceremonies that demonstrated his special relationship with heaven. So, what did this actually look like in practice? Well, the king's calendar was packed with religious festivals, seasonal celebrations, and political ceremonies that required his personal participation. Easter required weeks of special masses and processions. Christmas meant elaborate gift ceremonies with hundreds of nobles. Harvest festivals required the king to bless crops and livestock. Victory celebrations after military campaigns could last for days. But here's where it gets really demanding. Each of these ceremonies had to be performed perfectly, because any mistake could be interpreted as a sign that God was withdrawing his support from the king. If the king stumbled during a procession, people might think it was an omen of defeat. If he wore the wrong colors during a religious ceremony, it could be seen as disrespect toward the church. If he failed to follow the proper protocol during a diplomatic meeting, it could trigger an international incident. So, medieval kings had to memorize incredibly complex ceremonial procedures for dozens of different types of events. They had to know exactly where to stand, what to say, when to bow, which crown to wear, and how to interact with different classes of people according to elaborate rules of precedence and protocol. And remember, this wasn't just about looking impressive. These ceremonies were actually crucial tools of political control. When a king appeared in full royal regalia, surrounded by his nobles and blessed by church officials, it sent a powerful message about his authority and legitimacy. People who might question his right to rule in private would find it much harder to rebel after witnessing these awe-inspiring displays of royal power. But the pressure of performing these ceremonies perfectly was enormous. The king was constantly being watched by hundreds or even thousands of people who were analyzing his every gesture for political meaning. A moment of weakness or uncertainty could undermine months of careful political maneuvering. This brings us to something that most people never think about when they imagine medieval royalty: the incredible physical demands of being a king. These weren't sedentary desk jobs where you could sit comfortably all day. Medieval kingship required enormous stamina, strength, and pain tolerance. First, there was all that traveling I mentioned earlier. We're talking about spending months at a time on horseback, riding for 8 to 12 hours a day on roads that were basically just muddy tracks full of rocks and holes. Medieval saddles weren't comfortable leather chairs like modern ones. They were hard wooden frames that would leave you sore and bruised after just a few hours of riding. But the traveling was just the beginning. Kings had to be able to fight in full armor that weighed 60 to 80 pounds. They had to be skilled with multiple weapons, including swords, lances, maces, and crossbows. They had to be able to control a war in the chaos of battle while making tactical decisions. And it wasn't just about combat skills. Medieval kings had to have the physical presence and stamina to command respect from hardened warriors who had spent their entire lives training for violence. If a king looked weak or tired during a military campaign, his own soldiers might start questioning whether he was fit to lead them into battle. The physical demands extended to everyday court life as well. Those elaborate ceremonies I mentioned earlier often required standing for hours in heavy, formal clothing and uncomfortable crowns. Royal banquets could last all night, and the king was expected to remain alert and socially engaged throughout the entire event. Medieval castles were cold, drafty, and often unhealthy places to live. There was no central heating, limited sanitation, and primitive medical care. Kings regularly got sick from contaminated food, infected wounds, and exposure to harsh weather during military campaigns. But they couldn't afford to show weakness or take time off to recover, because that would give their enemies opportunities to strike. The combination of physical stress, constant travel, irregular meals, and chronic sleep deprivation took a severe toll on royal health. Many medieval kings died in their 30s or 40s from what we would now recognize as stress-related illnesses. Infections that could have been easily treated with modern medicine, or complications from injuries sustained in battle. But here's what makes this even more impressive. Despite these crushing physical demands, kings still had to maintain their mental sharpness for complex political and administrative tasks. They had to make important decisions while exhausted, injured, or sick. They had to negotiate delicate diplomatic agreements while dealing with chronic pain from old battle wounds. They had to analyze complex economic problems while suffering from medieval medical treatments that were often worse than the original illness. Now, let's talk about something that might surprise you about medieval kings: their relationship with money and personal wealth. Because while we tend to think of medieval royalty as incredibly rich people who could afford anything they wanted, the financial reality of kingship was actually much more complicated and stressful than you might expect. Yes, medieval kings had access to enormous wealth compared to ordinary people. They owned vast amounts of land, collected taxes from millions of subjects, and controlled valuable natural resources like mines and forests. But here's the thing that most people don't realize. Almost all of that wealth was tied up in assets that couldn't be easily converted to cash, and the king's expenses were absolutely staggering. Think about it this way. The king had to maintain dozens of castles and royal residences. Each one required permanent staff, regular repairs, and expensive furnishings that demonstrated royal status. He had to support a traveling household of hundreds of people, including their salaries, food, clothing, and equipment. He had to maintain armies that could cost more in a single campaign than most kingdoms generated in tax revenue over an entire year. But the really challenging part was that royal income was unpredictable and seasonal. Tax collection depended on successful harvests, which could be ruined by bad weather, disease, or enemy raids. Trade revenues fluctuated based on international conflicts and economic conditions beyond the king's control. Military victories could bring in massive amounts of plunder, but military defeats could bankrupt the entire kingdom. So, medieval kings were constantly dealing with cash flow problems that would challenge modern financial experts. They had to figure out how to pay for immediate military needs while maintaining long-term investments in infrastructure and political relationships. They had to balance the need to appear wealthy and powerful with the practical reality of limited liquid assets. This led to some fascinating financial strategies that show how sophisticated medieval economic thinking could be. Kings would borrow money from Italian banking houses and Jewish moneylenders using future tax revenues as collateral. They would sell royal privileges and monopolies to raise quick cash for military campaigns. They would manipulate currency values to improve their kingdom's trade balance. But these financial maneuvers were incredibly risky. Defaulting on loans could destroy relationships with important creditors. Debasing the currency could trigger inflation and social unrest. Selling too many royal privileges could undermine the king's long-term political authority. And unlike modern governments, medieval kings didn't have sophisticated financial institutions or economic advisors to help them manage these challenges. They had to rely on their own judgment and whatever advice they could get from merchants, church officials, and foreign diplomats who might have their own hidden agendas. The pressure of these financial responsibilities was enormous, and it shows up repeatedly in historical records. Kings who made poor financial decisions often found themselves unable to pay their armies, which led to military defeats and political collapse. Others became so desperate for revenue that they imposed crushing taxes on their subjects, which triggered rebellions that destroyed their kingdoms. But the kings who succeeded learned to think like sophisticated financial managers. They diversified their revenue sources, maintained good relationships with creditors, and invested royal resources in projects that would generate long-term returns. They understood that financial stability was just as important as military strength for maintaining royal power. This brings us to one of the most emotionally demanding aspects of medieval kingship: the complete lack of privacy and personal relationships that we would recognize as normal. Because when you're the king, every aspect of your personal life becomes a matter of political significance that affects the entire kingdom. Medieval kings couldn't just marry for love like ordinary people. Every royal marriage was a diplomatic alliance that could determine whether kingdoms went to war or made peace. The king's choice of bride affected trade relationships, military agreements, and the balance of power across Europe. And once he was married, the queen's behavior, the royal couple's relationship, and especially their ability to produce male heirs, became matters of national importance. But it wasn't just marriage that was politicized. The king's friendships were analyzed for political meaning. His hobbies and interests were seen as reflections of royal priorities. Even his health and personal habits were constantly scrutinized by courtiers looking for signs of weakness or opportunity. This meant that medieval king required sacrificing most of what we would consider a normal personal life in service of their political and governmental responsibilities. Now, here's something that will completely change how you think about medieval kingship: the incredible intellectual demands of the job. Because contrary to popular stereotypes about the Dark Ages, successful medieval kings had to be incredibly well educated and intellectually sophisticated to handle the complex challenges of ruling a kingdom. First, they had to master multiple languages. Latin was essential for communicating with church officials and reading legal documents. French was the diplomatic language used in international negotiations. The king also needed to speak the local languages of different regions in his kingdom, because effective rule required direct communication with subjects from various cultural backgrounds, but language skills were just the beginning. Medieval kings had to understand law, theology, history, military strategy, economics, natural philosophy, and diplomatic protocol. They needed to be able to analyze complex political situations, understand the implications of different policy choices, and make decisions that balanced competing interests and priorities. The intellectual challenges were constantly evolving as well. New military technologies required understanding innovations in weapons, fortifications, and battlefield tactics. Changes in trade patterns demanded knowledge of international economics and commercial law. Theological disputes within the church required sophisticated understanding of religious doctrine and political implications. Kings who weren't intellectually curious or capable of continuous learning quickly found themselves outmaneuvered by smarter rivals or unable to adapt to changing circumstances. The medieval world was far more dynamic and complex than most people realize, and successful leadership required constantly updating knowledge and skills. This intellectual development had to happen while simultaneously managing all the other demands of kingship. Kings couldn't take sabbaticals to study or hire tutors for extended educational programs. They had to let kings live their entire lives, surrounded by people who were watching their every move and analyzing everything they said for hidden meanings. They couldn't have casual conversations or moments of relaxation, because anything they did might be reported to enemies or used against them in political maneuvering. The emotional toll of this constant surveillance was enormous. Kings had to be incredibly careful about showing their true feelings or opinions, because any sign of doubt, fear, or weakness could be exploited by rivals. They had to maintain a facade of confidence and authority, even during personal crises or moments of genuine uncertainty. Many medieval kings seem to have struggled with loneliness and paranoia as a result of these pressures. They were surrounded by hundreds of people every day, but they couldn't trust any of them completely. Even their closest advisors and family members might have competing loyalties or hidden agendas that could threaten royal authority. This isolation was made worse by the fact that kings couldn't seek help or emotional support from anyone without appearing weak. They had to project strength and self-sufficiency at all times, even when they were dealing with problems that would overwhelm ordinary people. The psychological pressure of this lifestyle shows up in historical accounts of royal behavior that seems erratic or extreme. Kings who became increasingly suspicious of their advisors, rulers who made impulsive decisions that damaged their kingdoms, monarchs who turned to alcohol or other destructive behaviors to cope with stress. But the kings who survived and thrived were the ones who found ways to maintain their emotional equilibrium. Despite these crushing psychological pressures, they learned to compartmentalize their personal feelings and focus on the practical demands of leadership. They developed trusted relationships with a small circle of advisors who could provide honest counsel without threatening royal authority. Most importantly, they understood that being a successful Marn on the job while making life and death decisions that affected millions of people. Many successful medieval kings were genuinely brilliant individuals who would have excelled in any historical period. They had to be strategic thinkers, skilled negotiators, effective communicators, and quick learners all at the same time. The combination of intellectual demands and practical pressures created a leadership challenge that was probably more difficult than anything faced by modern political leaders. But perhaps the most demanding aspect of medieval kingship was something that ties together all of these different challenges. The constant awareness that failure meant not just personal disappointment, but the complete destruction of everything the king had worked to build. Modern political leaders who make mistakes might lose elections or face criticism, but their countries continue to exist and their families remain safe. Medieval kings who failed faced conquest, exile, execution, and the complete elimination of their dynasties. The stakes of every decision were literally life and death, not just for the king himself, but for everyone who depended on his success. This knowledge shaped every aspect of royal decision-making and created a level of pressure that's almost impossible for us to imagine today. Every morning when a medieval king woke up, he knew that the choices he made that day could determine whether his kingdom survived or fell to enemies who would show no mercy to him or his family. The weight of this responsibility was enormous, and it required a level of mental toughness and emotional resilience that few people possess. Medieval kings had to function effectively under constant stress, while making complex decisions with incomplete information and dealing with threats that could emerge from any direction at any time. Yet, despite all of these crushing demands and pressures, many medieval kings not only survived, but actually thrived and built lasting legacies that shaped European civilization for centuries. They created legal systems, cultural institutions, and political structures that influenced the development of modern democratic governments. The daily life of a medieval king was far more complex, demanding, and stressful than most people realize. These weren't lazy aristocrats lounging around in luxury. They were working incredibly hard under enormous pressure to solve problems that would challenge the most capable modern leaders. Understanding the full scope of what medieval kings accomplished requires looking at how they managed their time and energy across all these different responsibilities. Because here's something that will absolutely blow your mind. These rulers didn't have the luxury of focusing on just one crisis at a time. They had to juggle multiple catastrophic problems simultaneously while maintaining the appearance of complete control. Imagine waking up on a Monday morning and learning that Vikings have raided 3 coastal towns. Your most powerful duke is threatening rebellion because you denied his marriage request. The harvest failed in 2 provinces and people are starting to starve. Your treasury is nearly empty because you spent everything on the last military campaign. And oh, by the way, the Pope is demanding that you launch a crusade to the Holy Land within 6 months. That wasn't an unusually bad week for a medieval king. That was just Tuesday. And somehow these rulers had to address all of these crises simultaneously, while still maintaining their regular schedule of court ceremonies, legal hearings, military training, and diplomatic meetings. The key to understanding how they managed this impossible workload is recognizing that medieval kings developed what we might call extreme multitasking skills that went far beyond anything we see in modern leadership. They learned to conduct multiple types of business during the same activities and conversations. For example, a royal hunting expedition wasn't just recreation. It was simultaneously a military training exercise where the king practiced cavalry skills and weapons handling. It was a diplomatic opportunity where he could have private conversations with important nobles away from the formal constraints of court protocol. It was an intelligence-gathering operation where he could learn about conditions in different parts of his territory. It was a public relations event where common people could see their king, demonstrating the physical prowess and courage expected of a warrior leader. A single hunting trip might accomplish the equivalent of what would take a modern executive dozens of separate meetings, training sessions, and fact-finding missions to achieve. Medieval kings had to think in these multi-layered ways about every activity in their schedule because there simply weren't enough hours in the day. Address each responsibility separately. This multitasking extended to their communication strategies as well. A single royal letter might contain military orders, economic policy directives, legal judgments, and diplomatic negotiations, all woven together in carefully crafted language that sent different messages to different audiences. The king's scribes had to be incredibly skilled to help draft documents that accomplished multiple political objectives simultaneously. But perhaps the most impressive example of this multitasking approach was how medieval kings handled what we might call crisis management. When a major emergency erupted, they couldn't just drop everything else and focus exclusively on solving that one problem. They had to continue managing all their other responsibilities while simultaneously dealing with whatever catastrophe had just emerged. Let's walk through a specific example that shows how this worked in practice. Say a foreign army has just invaded your kingdom and is marching toward your capital city. Obviously, this requires immediate military response. But a medieval king couldn't just grab his sword and charge off to battle. First, he had to secure his kingdom's political stability. Before leaving for the campaign, this meant meeting with his most powerful nobles to ensure their continued loyalty, making arrangements for governing the kingdom in his absence, and taking hostages from potentially unreliable lords to prevent rebellions while he was away fighting the invasion. Simultaneously, he had to organize the financial resources needed for the military campaign. This required negotiating with moneylenders, calling in debts from his vassals, and possibly selling royal assets to raise the enormous sums needed to equip and supply an army. At the same time, he had to handle the diplomatic aspects of the crisis. This meant sending messages to potential allies, asking for military assistance, negotiating with neutral parties to prevent them from joining the enemy, and communicating with church officials to ensure their support for what he would frame as a just war. And while all of this was happening, he still had to maintain the regular functions of government. Legal cases couldn't just be postponed indefinitely while he dealt with the invasion. Tax collection had to continue to fund the war effort. Trade. Relationships had to be managed to prevent economic collapse during the military emergency. The logistical coordination required to handle all of these different aspects of crisis management simultaneously was absolutely staggering. The king had to keep track of dozens of different ongoing negotiations, military preparations, financial arrangements, and political maneuverings all at the same time. But here's what makes this even more impressive. Medieval kings had to manage all of this coordination without modern communication technology. There were no phones, no email, no instant messaging systems. Every important communication had to be written by hand, sealed with the royal seal, and carried by messengers on horseback, who might take days or weeks to reach their destinations. This meant that kings had to be incredibly skilled at long-term strategic planning and anticipating how different situations might develop over time. When they sent a message to a potential ally asking for military assistance, they had to predict what the political situation would look like by the time that message arrived and a response came back. They also had to build redundancy into their communication systems because messages could be intercepted by enemies. Messengers could be killed or captured, and important documents could be lost or delayed by bad weather or dangerous road conditions. Smart kings would send the same message through multiple channels and use coded language to protect sensitive information from hostile interception. The mental demands of keeping track of all these different communication threads, while simultaneously managing military, political, and economic crises, would challenge the most sophisticated modern leaders. Medieval kings had to do it all with nothing more than their personal memory, handwritten notes, and whatever organizational systems they could develop with their small staffs of clerks and advisors. Now, let's dive into something that reveals just how demanding the intellectual side of medieval kingship really was. The king's role as the ultimate legal authority for his entire kingdom. Because this wasn't just about making occasional high-profile decisions in important cases. Medieval kings were essentially running the entire judicial system and had to understand legal principles that would challenge modern lawyers and judges. The complexity started with the fact that medieval kingdoms typically had multiple overlapping legal systems that all claimed authority over different types of cases and different classes of people. There was royal law that applied to cases involving the crown's direct interests. There was church law that governed moral and religious matters. There was feudal law that regulated relationships between lords and vassals. There were local customs and traditions that varied from region to region within the same kingdom. The king had to understand all of these different legal frameworks and figure out which one applied to each case that came before him. But it gets even more complicated because many cases involve conflicts between different legal systems. What happened when church law said one thing and royal law said something else? How did you handle disputes between people who were subject to different legal traditions? These weren't abstract theoretical problems. They were practical dilemmas that could determine whether someone lived or died, whether families kept their ancestral lands, whether entire regions remained loyal to the crown, or rebelled against royal authority. The king's legal decisions had immediate and far-reaching political consequences that could affect the stability of his entire kingdom. But medieval kings couldn't just make arbitrary decisions based on their personal preferences or political convenience. They had to justify their judgments according to established legal principles and precedents that would be accepted as legitimate by the various groups affected by their rulings. This required an incredibly sophisticated understanding of legal reasoning, historical precedents, and political implications. Kings had to be able to analyze complex factual disputes, evaluate conflicting testimony from witnesses who might be lying or mistaken, and apply abstract legal principles to specific situations that might not fit neatly into existing categories. The intellectual demands were made even more challenging by the fact that medieval law was heavily influenced by religious and moral considerations that modern legal systems tried to separate from practical, judicial decisions. Kings had to consider not just what was legally correct, but also what was morally right, according to Christian doctrine. What was politically wise, given the current balance of power, and what was practically enforceable, given the limited resources available for implementing their decisions. And remember, these legal decisions had to be made quickly, often with incomplete information and under intense pressure from competing interest groups, who all claimed that their version of events was correct and their desired outcome was just. The stakes were enormous, because legal decisions were one of the primary ways that medieval kings demonstrated their wisdom, fairness, and divine mandate to rule. A king who consistently made legal judgments that were seen as arbitrary, unfair, or incompetent would quickly lose the respect and loyalty of his subjects. But kings who developed reputations for wise and just legal decision-making could use that moral authority to strengthen their political position and solve other problems facing their kingdoms. People who trusted their king's judgment in legal matters were more likely to support him during military crisis, pay their taxes without resistance, and remain loyal during political challenges from rival claimants to the throne. This brings us to another aspect of medieval kingship that required incredible skill and emotional intelligence: managing the complex web of personal relationships that held medieval political systems together. Because, unlike modern governments that rely on bureaucratic institutions and legal frameworks, medieval kingdoms were essentially networks of personal loyalties and individual relationships. The king's ability to build and maintain these relationships determined whether his kingdom prospered or collapsed. He had to simultaneously manage relationships with dozens of powerful nobles, church officials, foreign rulers, military commanders, economic leaders, and regional administrators. Each of these relationships required different approaches and had different implications for royal policy. Consider the challenge of managing relationships with his own nobles. These were men who controlled their own armies, ruled their own territories, and had their own political ambitions and family interests. They owed loyalty to the king, but they also had independent sources of power that could make them dangerous if they became disaffected. The king had to find ways to keep these nobles happy and loyal, without giving them so much power that they could challenge royal authority. This required a delicate balance of rewards and constraints, opportunities and limitations that had to be constantly adjusted based on changing circumstances and shifting political dynamics. Some nobles could be motivated by grants of additional land or titles. Others were more interested in military commands that offered opportunities for glory and plunder. Still others were primarily concerned with protecting their family interests, or advancing their sons' careers at court. The king had to understand each noble's individual motivations and tailor his approach accordingly. But he also had to think about how his treatment of one noble would affect his relationships with others. Favoring one powerful lord might alienate his rivals. Punishing one rebel might intimidate others into submission, or it might convince them that they needed to rebel before the king moved against them, too. These relationship management challenges were complicated by the fact that medieval politics was intensely personal in ways that modern people might find difficult to understand. Political alliances were often based on family connections, personal friendships, shared military experiences, or mutual obligations that went back generations. A king might find himself caught between competing loyalties to men who had saved his life in battle, nobles whose families had served his dynasty for centuries, and church officials who claimed to represent God's will on earth. Balancing these different personal obligations while still making decisions that served the kingdom's broader interests required extraordinary diplomatic skill and emotional intelligence. The personal nature of medieval politics also meant that kings had to be incredibly careful about their own behavior and reputation. A king who was seen as ungrateful to his supporters, disloyal to his allies, or unfair in his treatment of different factions would find it very difficult to maintain the network of relationships that kept his kingdom functioning. But kings who developed reputations for honor, generosity, and loyalty could build political networks that were incredibly resilient and effective. People wanted to serve kings they respected and trusted. and this personal loyalty could overcome many of the structural challenges facing medieval governments. Now, let's talk about something that shows just how physically and mentally exhausting the daily routine of a medieval king really was. The constant travel and the incredible logistical challenges of moving the entire apparatus of government from place to place on a regular basis. Most people today can barely imagine what it was like to travel in the medieval period. There were no paved roads, no bridges over most rivers, no hotels or restaurants, no maps that could be trusted, and no weather forecasting to help plan journeys. Every trip was an adventure that could be delayed or derailed by storms, floods, bandit attacks, or simple mechanical problems with wagons and equipment. But medieval kings couldn't just stay home and avoid these travel difficulties. As I mentioned earlier, being seen by their subjects was absolutely crucial to maintaining political control. A king who stayed in one place too long would find that distant parts of his kingdom started to forget about him, and local lords began acting like independent rulers. So the royal household was constantly on the move, traveling from castle to castle, town to town, region to region in an endless circuit that covered thousands of miles every year. And when I say the royal household, I'm talking about a traveling circus that included hundreds of people and thousands of animals. There were the king's personal servants, bodyguards, and advisors. There were government clerks and scribes who handled the administrative work that continued even while traveling. There were cooks, stable hands, musicians, and entertainers who maintained the royal lifestyle on the road. There were craftsmen and artisans who repaired equipment and created the luxury goods that demonstrated royal wealth and status. All of these people had to be fed, housed, and paid while the household was traveling. They needed wagons for their personal belongings, tools for their work, and animals to pull the heavy carts loaded with royal furniture, clothing, documents, and ceremonial equipment that moved with the king wherever he went. The logistical coordination required to move this traveling city was absolutely mind-boggling. Someone had to plan routes that could accommodate hundreds of people and dozens of heavy wagons. Food and supplies had to be arranged at each stopping point. Accommodations had to be prepared for the entire household, which often meant taking over entire towns or requiring local lords to provide hospitality, whether they could afford it or not. But here's what makes this even more challenging. The king couldn't just focus on travel logistics while his household was on the road. He still had to conduct all the regular business of government while bouncing around in a medieval wagon on roads that were basically just muddy tracks full of rocks and holes. Legal cases had to be heard and decided. Military dispatches had to be read and responded to. Diplomatic correspondence had to be maintained with other kingdoms. Economic policies had to be implemented and adjusted. All of this complex governmental work had to happen while the king was physically uncomfortable, often sick from bad food or contaminated water, and dealing with the constant stress of managing a traveling household that was vulnerable to bandits, enemy attacks, or simple accidents. The physical toll of this lifestyle was enormous. Medieval kings aged quickly from the constant stress, irregular meals, poor sleeping conditions, and exposure to harsh weather during months of travel every year. Many died young from what we would now recognize as stress-related illnesses or complications from infections that could have been easily treated if they had access to modern medical care and the luxury of staying in one place long enough to recover properly. But the kings who survived this punishing lifestyle and thrived, despite its challenges, were the ones who learned to use travel as a tool of government rather than just seeing it as a necessary burden. They turned their constant movement into opportunities to gather intelligence, build relationships, solve local problems, and demonstrate royal power to subjects who might otherwise never see their king. Smart kings would time their travels to coincide with important local events like harvest festivals, religious celebrations, or seasonal markets where they could interact with large numbers of ordinary people. They would use their presence in different regions to resolve local disputes, inspect royal properties, and meet with regional administrators who were responsible for implementing royal policies. The most successful medieval kings turned their traveling households into mobile centers of government that could respond quickly to crisis anywhere in the kingdom. When news arrived of a foreign invasion, internal rebellion, or natural disaster, the king could immediately redirect his route to address the emergency personally rather than trying to manage the crisis from a distant capital. This mobility gave medieval kings a flexibility and responsiveness that would be envied by many modern leaders. But it came at an enormous personal cost in terms of physical hardship, family separation, and the constant stress of living without a permanent home or secure base of operations. The daily reality of medieval kingship was far more demanding, dangerous, and exhausting than most people realize. These rulers were working incredibly hard under crushing pressure to solve problems that would challenge the most capable modern leaders, all while dealing with physical hardships and personal sacrifices that few of us could endure. Yet, despite all of these challenges, many medieval kings not only survived, but actually accomplished remarkable things that shaped the course of European civilization. They've built legal systems that influenced modern democracy, established trade networks that connected different parts of the world, created cultural institutions that preserved knowledge through dark periods of history, and developed political innovations that solved complex problems of governance and social organization. The next time you see a movie about medieval kings lounging around in luxury, remember that the reality was completely different. These were some of the hardest working, most pressured, and most accomplished leaders in human history. Their daily lives were filled with challenges that would overwhelm most modern executives, politicians, or military commanders. But before we can fully appreciate what made the most successful medieval king so remarkable, we need to understand one more crucial aspect of their daily lives that ties together all of these different challenges and responsibilities. That crucial aspect was something that might shock you about medieval kingship: the incredible emotional and psychological burden of making decisions that could literally determine whether thousands or even millions of people lived or died. Because here's what most people don't realize about medieval rulers: every single choice they made carried life and death consequences that would haunt modern leaders. Think about this for a moment. When a modern political leader makes a mistake, people might lose jobs or face economic hardship. When a medieval king made a mistake, entire cities could be burned to the ground. Thousands of families could be slaughtered, and entire bloodlines could be wiped from existence. The weight of that responsibility was absolutely crushing. Let me paint you a picture of what this actually looked like in practice. The king wakes up one morning and receives reports that enemy forces are approaching 3 different parts of his kingdom simultaneously. He has enough military resources to defend 2 of those locations effectively, but not all 3. So, he has to choose which towns and villages will receive protection and which ones will be left to face invasion, conquest, rape, pillage, and murder. How do you make that choice? Do you save the largest population center and sacrifice the smaller communities? Do you protect the economically important regions and abandon the poor agricultural areas? Do you defend the places with the most political significance and let the others burn? There's no good answer. And whatever decision you make will result in the deaths of people who trusted you to protect them. But here's what makes this even more psychologically devastating. The king would often know many of these people personally. Medieval kingdoms were much smaller and more personal than modern nations. The king might have visited those threatened towns during his travels. He might have met the local lords, blessed their children, attended their weddings, heard their legal disputes. These weren't abstract statistics on a government report. These were real people with faces and names and families who were depending on him to save their lives. Now, imagine having to live with the knowledge that your decision condemned hundreds or thousands of those people to death. Imagine receiving reports weeks later about what happened to the places you chose not to defend. Imagine meeting the survivors and seeing the accusation in their eyes, even if they're too afraid or respectful to voice their anger directly. The psychological toll of carrying that kind of responsibility would break most people. And remember, medieval kings had to make these kinds of impossible choices not once in a lifetime, but regularly throughout their reigns. Every major decision involved trade-offs that meant some people would live and others would die. But it wasn't just military decisions that carried these crushing moral burdens. Economic policies had life and death consequences too. Raising taxes to fund necessary government services might prevent starvation in one region, while triggering famine in another area that could no longer afford food. Granting trade privileges to foreign merchants might bring prosperity to port cities while destroying the livelihoods of domestic craftsmen and their families. Even seemingly simple administrative decisions could have devastating unintended consequences. Appointing the wrong person to a regional governorship might lead to corruption, oppression, and eventually rebellion that costs thousands of lives. Choosing the wrong marriage alliance might trigger a war that lasts for decades and destroys multiple kingdoms. Medieval kings lived with the constant awareness that their judgment was literally the difference between life and death for countless people. They couldn't delegate these ultimate decisions to subordinates or hide behind bureaucratic processes. The responsibility was entirely theirs, and everyone knew it. This created a level of psychological pressure that's almost impossible for modern people to comprehend. Every mistake was amplified into a catastrophe. Every success was temporary and fragile. Every decision opened up new possibilities for future disasters that the king would be personally responsible for preventing or managing. The loneliness of this burden was made worse by the fact that kings couldn't share their doubts or fears with anyone without appearing weak and undermining their authority. They had to project confidence and certainty, even when they were genuinely uncertain about what the right choice might be. They had to convince everyone around them that they were capable of handling these impossible responsibilities, even when they were privately terrified of making the wrong decision. Many medieval kings developed what we would now recognize as chronic anxiety, depression, or post-traumatic stress from the cumulative weight of these moral burdens. Historical records describe rulers who became increasingly paranoid, erratic, or withdrawn as they aged and accumulated more traumatic experiences of seeing their decisions lead to suffering and death. But the most successful medieval kings were the ones who found ways to cope with these psychological pressures without losing their ability to function effectively as leaders. They developed mental frameworks that allowed them to accept the tragic reality that leadership sometimes requires choosing between different forms of suffering. Rather than finding perfect solutions that avoid all harm, they learned to focus on making the best decisions possible with the information available, rather than torturing themselves over outcomes they couldn't control. They found ways to honor the people who died as a result of their choices, while still maintaining the emotional strength needed to keep making difficult decisions in the future. Most importantly, they understood that the alternative to making these hard choices wasn't avoiding responsibility for death and suffering. The alternative was allowing their kingdoms to collapse into chaos, where even more people would die from war, famine, disease, and social breakdown. The burden of leadership was accepting responsibility for some deaths in order to prevent even greater catastrophes. Now, let's talk about something that reveals just how sophisticated medieval kings had to be as strategic thinkers. Their approach to what we would now call intelligence gathering and information warfare. Because successful medieval rulers weren't just making decisions based on whatever information happened to come their way. They were actively building and managing complex intelligence networks that would impress modern spy agencies. Think about the challenge these kings faced. They needed to know what was happening in every corner of their own kingdoms, what their enemies were planning, what their allies were really thinking, what foreign rulers were negotiating with each other, and what ordinary people were saying about royal policies. All of this intelligence gathering had to happen in an age without telecommunications, photography, or any of the technological tools that modern intelligence services take for granted. So, how did medieval kings solve this problem? They created sophisticated human intelligence networks that relied on personal relationships, financial incentives, and careful psychological manipulation to gather information from sources throughout Europe and beyond. Royal courts were filled with foreign diplomats, traveling merchants, visiting scholars, and other people who had access to information from distant places. Smart kings learned to extract intelligence from these visitors through careful questioning. During seemingly casual social interactions, a conversation about trade conditions might reveal information about military preparations. A discussion of religious matters might provide insights into political tensions in neighboring kingdoms. But passive intelligence gathering wasn't enough. Medieval kings also recruited active agents who would travel to foreign courts, infiltrate enemy organizations, and report back on everything they observed. These weren't professional spies in the modern sense, but rather trusted individuals who combined intelligence gathering with their regular activities as merchants, pilgrims, scholars, or diplomatic representatives. The most effective intelligence networks included people from all levels of society. Servants in enemy castles could report on private conversations between hostile nobles. Merchants could observe military preparations and economic conditions in foreign territories. Church officials could provide information about political discussions that happened during religious meetings and ceremonies. Managing these intelligence networks required incredible skill in human psychology and relationship management. Kings had to identify people who had access to valuable information and figure out how to motivate them to share it. Some agents were motivated by money, others by political beliefs, and still others by personal loyalty to the king or hatred of his enemies. But intelligence gathering was only half the battle. Medieval kings also had to master what we would now call information warfare by controlling how information spread throughout their own kingdoms and beyond. They needed to promote narratives that supported their authority, while suppressing stories that might undermine their legitimacy or encourage rebellion. This required sophisticated understanding of how information traveled in medieval society. News spread through merchant networks, religious organizations, traveling entertainers, and the constantly moving populations of soldiers, craftsmen, and agricultural workers. Kings had to influence all of these communication channels to ensure that their preferred version of events reached their subjects before enemy propaganda could take hold. Royal courts became centers of what we might call medieval media production. Kings employed chroniclers, poets, musicians, and artists who created official versions of important events that portrayed the royal government in the most favorable possible light. These creative works weren't just entertainment. They were political tools designed to shape public opinion and reinforce royal authority. But controlling information flow required more than just producing royal propaganda. Kings also had to suppress or counter hostile narratives that could damage their reputations or encourage opposition to their rule. This meant monitoring what people were saying in taverns, markets, and other gathering places where public opinion was formed. The most sophisticated medieval kings understood that information warfare was just as important as military campaigns for determining who held power. They invested enormous resources in gathering intelligence about their enemies and controlling how their own actions were perceived by their subjects and foreign observers. Now, here's something that will absolutely blow your mind about the complexity of medieval kingship. The incredible diplomatic sophistication required to manage relationships, not just with other kingdoms, but with the dozens of semi-independent political entities that existed within medieval Europe. We tend to think of medieval politics in terms of simple relationships between different kingdoms. But the reality was far more complex. A typical medieval king had to simultaneously manage diplomatic relationships with other royal courts, powerful duchies and counties within his own kingdom, independent city-states, merchant guilds, religious orders, military organizations like the Knights Templar, and various tribal or ethnic groups that maintained some degree of autonomy. Each of these relationships required different diplomatic approaches and had different implications for royal policy. The king couldn't just treat everyone the same way, because what worked with one group might be completely counterproductive with another. Consider the challenge of managing relationships with powerful merchant guilds. These organizations controlled vital trade routes and economic resources, but they also had their own political agendas and competing loyalties. The king needed their economic support and cooperation, but he also had to prevent them from becoming so powerful that they could challenge royal authority. This required a delicate balance of granting privileges and imposing restrictions, offering protection and demanding loyalty, supporting their economic interests while maintaining political control. The king had to understand the internal politics of each guild, the personalities and motivations of their leaders, and the economic factors that influenced their decisions. But merchant relationships were just one aspect of this diplomatic complexity. Medieval kings also had to manage relationships with various religious organizations that claimed authority over different aspects of social and political life. The Catholic Church was obviously the most important religious institution, but there were also numerous monastic orders, religious brotherhoods, and local religious communities that had their own political influence and economic resources. Each religious organization had its own interpretation of Christian doctrine, its own political preferences, and its own economic interests that might conflict with royal policy. The king had to navigate these religious politics without alienating any group so badly that they would actively oppose his rule or support his enemies. The diplomatic challenges became even more complex when dealing with ethnic and cultural minorities within the kingdom. Medieval kingdoms typically included populations with different languages, customs, legal traditions, and historical grievances. The king had to find ways to maintain their loyalty while still enforcing royal authority and preventing separatist movements that could fragment his territory. This required deep understanding of different cultural values, historical memories, and political aspirations. What motivated one ethnic group might be completely irrelevant to another. What one community saw as generous royal patronage, another might interpret as insulting condescension or cultural oppression. Medieval kings who succeeded at managing this diplomatic complexity were the ones who invested enormous time and energy in understanding the perspectives and interests of all these different groups. They learned to speak multiple languages, understand different cultural traditions, and adapt their communication styles to different audiences. They also developed sophisticated strategies for playing different groups off against each other when necessary, while avoiding the kind of manipulative behavior that would destroy their credibility and trustworthiness. The most successful kings were seen as fair mediators who could resolve conflicts between different factions rather than as partisan leaders who favored some groups over others. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of medieval diplomatic management was how kings handled the constant tension between competing loyalties and obligations. Almost everyone in medieval society owed allegiance to multiple different authorities, and these competing loyalties created endless opportunities for conflict and political manipulation. A powerful noble might owe military service to the king, religious obedience to the pope, economic obligations to merchant guilds, and family loyalty to relatives who served foreign rulers. When these different loyalties came into conflict, the noble had to choose which obligation took priority, and the king had to influence that choice without appearing to be unreasonable or tyrannical. Medieval kings became masters of what we might call loyalty management, finding ways to structure incentives and obligations so that people's various loyalties reinforced, rather than contradicted, their duties to the crown. This required incredible subtlety and long-term strategic thinking that went far beyond simple reward and punishment approaches to political control. The daily reality of managing all these complex diplomatic relationships while simultaneously handling military crises, economic problems, and administrative responsibilities required a level of political sophistication that would challenge the most experienced modern leaders. Medieval kings had to be strategic thinkers, skilled negotiators, cultural anthropologists, and psychological manipulators, all at the same time. Yet, despite the incredible complexity of these challenges, many medieval kings not only managed to hold their kingdoms together, but actually expanded their territories, strengthened their institutions, and left legacies that influenced European development for centuries to come. This brings us to something that ties together all of these different aspects of medieval kingship and shows why the daily life of these rulers was so much more demanding than most people realize. The constant pressure of knowing that everything you had built could be destroyed overnight by a single bad decision or unexpected crises. Modern political leaders operate within stable institutional frameworks that provide some protection against catastrophic failure. Even if a president or prime minister makes serious mistakes, the country's government, economy, and social structure will probably survive. But medieval kingdoms were much more fragile and dependent on the personal capabilities of their rulers. A medieval king who lost a major battle might see his entire kingdom conquered by enemies who would kill his family, disperse his supporters, and erase his dynasty from history. A king who made the wrong economic decisions might trigger famines that killed hundreds of thousands of his subjects and destroyed the agricultural base that supported his government. A king who mishandled diplomatic relationships might find himself facing coalitions of enemies that were too powerful to resist. This fragility meant that medieval kings lived with constant awareness that their next decision might be their last. Every choice carried the potential for catastrophic consequences that could undo decades of careful work in building and strengthening their kingdoms. The psychological pressure of this reality shaped every aspect of how they approached their daily responsibilities. It explains why medieval kings were willing to endure the physical hardships of constant travel, the emotional isolation of supreme authority, and the crushing workload of managing every aspect of government personally. They understood that the alternative to accepting these burdens was risking the complete destruction of everything they cared about. It also explains why successful medieval kings developed such remarkable skills in so many different areas. They had to be excellent at everything, because failure in any one area could trigger cascading disasters that destroyed their entire kingdom. There was no room for specialization or delegation of the most critical decisions. The daily life of a medieval king was essentially a high-stakes performance, where every scene had to be played perfectly because the audience was constantly looking for signs of weakness, incompetence, or vulnerability that they could exploit. The king had to project strength while feeling fear, demonstrate wisdom while facing impossible choices, and maintain authority while depending on the loyalty of people who might betray him at any moment. But here's what makes the achievements of successful medieval kings so remarkable. Despite all of these crushing pressures and impossible challenges, they found ways not just to survive, but to create lasting institutions, cultural achievements, and political innovations that shaped the development of Western civilization. They built legal systems that established principles of justice and individual rights that influenced modern democracy. They created economic institutions that facilitated trade and prosperity across vast regions of Europe. They established educational and cultural institutions that preserved knowledge and promoted learning during periods of social chaos and political instability. Most importantly, they developed models of leadership and governance that showed how individual skill, courage, and dedication could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles and create positive change, even in the most difficult circumstances. The next time you think about medieval kings, remember that these weren't primitive autocrats who ruled through simple force and intimidation. They were sophisticated leaders who mastered incredibly complex challenges while operating under constraints and pressures that would overwhelm most modern politicians and executives. Their daily lives were filled with responsibilities and decisions that required expertise in military strategy, economic policy, legal reasoning, diplomatic negotiation, cultural understanding, and psychological manipulation. They had to excel at all of these different skills simultaneously while dealing with physical hardships, emotional isolation, and the constant threat of violent death. Yet, many of them not only survived these challenges, but actually thrived and built legacies that lasted for centuries. Understanding how they accomplished this requires looking more closely at the specific strategies and techniques they developed for managing the overwhelming complexity of medieval kingship. But the question remains, how did the most successful medieval kings actually develop these extraordinary capabilities? The answer lies in something that most people never consider about royal education and preparation. Medieval princes weren't just born into power and expected to figure things out on their own. Instead, they underwent incredibly intensive training, programs that would make modern militaries look like summer camps. From the moment a prince could walk, his education was focused on preparing him for the crushing responsibilities of kingship. But this wasn't just about learning to read Latin or memorize genealogies of noble families. Medieval royal education was a comprehensive program designed to develop every skill that would be needed to survive and thrive as a ruler. Physical training was absolutely brutal by modern standards. Young princes were expected to master horseback riding, not just for transportation, but for mounted combat in full armor, while controlling a war in the chaos of battle. They had to become expert swordsmen, archers, and tacticians who could personally lead troops into life-or-death situations. But the physical training was just the foundation. Medieval princes also received intensive education in languages, law, theology, mathematics, natural philosophy, and what we would now call political science. They had to understand the complex relationships between different noble families, the economic foundations of royal power, and the diplomatic protocols that governed international relations. Most importantly, they were trained in decision under pressure through carefully designed scenarios that simulated the kinds of crises they would face as kings. Experienced advisors would present them with complex problems that had no perfect solutions and require them to make choices while dealing with incomplete information, competing pressures, and time constraints. This educational process continued throughout their lives. Even after becoming king, successful medieval rulers never stopped learning and adapting their skills to meet new challenges. They studied the successes and failures of other kings, analyzed changing military technologies and political developments, and constantly refined their approaches to leadership based on experience. But here's something that reveals just how sophisticated medieval royal training really was. These educational programs weren't just about developing individual skills. They were also about building the psychological resilience and emotional control needed to function effectively under the crushing pressures of kingship. Medieval princes were deliberately exposed to stressful situations, difficult moral dilemmas, and experiences of failure and loss that would prepare them for the emotional challenges of royal responsibility. They learned to make decisions while dealing with fear, uncertainty, and the knowledge that people would die as a result of their choices. This psychological preparation was crucial because, as we've seen, medieval kingship required maintaining perfect composure and projecting confidence, even in the most desperate situations. Kings who showed panic, indecision, or emotional breakdown would quickly lose the respect and loyalty of their subjects and find themselves facing rebellions or foreign invasions. The most successful medieval kings were the ones who had internalized these lessons so completely that they could function effectively, even when facing seemingly impossible challenges. They had developed what we might call supreme emotional intelligence that allowed them to read people, manage relationships, and inspire loyalty even when everything seemed to be falling apart around them. Now, let's examine something that shows just how strategically sophisticated medieval kings had to be. Their approach to what we would now call succession planning and dynasty building. Because medieval rulers couldn't just focus on solving immediate problems. They also had to think decades into the future and create systems that would allow their kingdoms to survive and prosper long after their own deaths. This was incredibly challenging because medieval kingdoms faced constant threats that could destroy royal dynasties overnight. Enemy invasions, internal rebellions, natural disasters, economic collapses, and simple accidents could eliminate entire royal families and leave kingdoms without legitimate rulers. So successful medieval kings had to develop comprehensive strategies for ensuring dynastic continuity, while also preparing their heirs to handle the enormous responsibilities they would inherit. This required balancing multiple competing objectives that often conflicted with each other in complex ways. On one hand, kings needed to concentrate enough power in their own hands to deal effectively with immediate threats and maintain political stability. But they also had to avoid concentrating so much power that their kingdoms would collapse if something happened to them personally. They had to prepare their eldest sons to become effective rulers, while also ensuring that younger sons remain loyal rather than becoming rival claimants who might trigger civil wars. They had to build strong institutions that could function during transitions between rulers, while also maintaining enough personal control to prevent those institutions from being captured by hostile factions. The diplomatic aspects of succession planning were particularly complex. Medieval kings had to negotiate marriage alliances that would strengthen their dynasties while avoiding commitments that might drag their kingdoms into unwanted conflicts. They had to balance relationships with foreign powers, powerful domestic nobles, and church officials who all had different preferences about royal succession. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of dynastic planning was preparing heirs who would be capable of handling responsibilities that were constantly evolving as political, military, and economic conditions changed. A prince who was perfectly prepared to rule in 1200 might be completely unprepared for the challenges facing kingdoms in 1250. This required medieval kings to think not just about current problems, but about how their kingdoms might need to adapt to future developments that were impossible to predict with certainty. They had to prepare their heirs to be flexible, innovative, and capable of learning quickly rather than just teaching them to follow established procedures. The most successful medieval dynasties were the ones that created systems for continuously developing royal capabilities across multiple generations. They established traditions of rigorous education, practical experience, and gradual assumption of responsibility that prepared each new ruler to exceed the achievements of their predecessors. But even the most careful succession planning could be disrupted by unexpected events that no one could anticipate or control. Medieval history is full of kingdoms that seemed stable and well prepared for dynastic transitions only to collapse when unexpected. Crises revealed weaknesses in their systems or capabilities. This uncertainty meant that medieval kings had to live with the constant awareness that everything they built might not survive their own deaths. They had to find ways to create lasting value and positive change, while accepting that their personal legacies were ultimately fragile and dependent on factors beyond their control. Yet, despite these challenges, many medieval kings succeeded in building dynasties that lasted for centuries and created institutions that influenced European development long after their royal lines had ended. Understanding how they accomplish this requires looking at the specific strategies they used to balance immediate effectiveness with long-term sustainability. Now, here's something that will completely change how you think about medieval royal decision: the incredible sophistication of the advisory systems that successful kings developed to help them process information and analyze complex problems. Contrary to popular stereotypes about medieval autocracy, the most effective kings didn't make important decisions in isolation. Instead, they created elaborate systems of advisors, councils, and consultative processes that allowed them to gather expertise, consider different perspectives, and test their ideas before implementing major policies. But these weren't just informal groups of friends giving casual advice. Medieval royal councils were carefully structured organizations with specific roles, procedures, and areas of expertise that allowed them to function as sophisticated decision-making systems. A typical royal council might include military commanders, who provided expertise on defense and warfare, church officials who offered guidance on religious and moral issues, legal experts who ensured that royal decisions were consistent with established law and precedent, economic advisors who analyzed the financial implications of different policies, and diplomatic specialists who understood international relations and foreign affairs. But the really impressive aspect of these systems was how medieval kings learned to use them effectively while still maintaining ultimate decision-making authority. They had to create processes that encouraged honest advice and open debate while preventing their councils from becoming sources of political opposition or institutional resistance to royal policies. This required incredible skill in group psychology and organizational management. Kings had to identify advisors who had genuine expertise and good judgment, but who also remained personally loyal and committed to royal interests rather than their own political agendas. They had to create environments where advisors felt safe expressing unpopular opinions or challenging royal assumptions while still maintaining enough authority to make final decisions without being paralyzed by endless debate or conflicting. The most successful medieval kings became masters of what we might call collaborative autocracy, combining the efficiency of centralized decision with the wisdom of collective expertise in deliberation. They learned to use their advisory systems to improve the quality of their decisions while still maintaining the speed and flexibility needed to respond quickly to crisis. But managing these advisory systems required constant attention and adjustment as circumstances changed and new challenges emerged. Kings had to continuously evaluate the performance of their advisors, identify gaps in their expertise, and recruit new talent to address evolving problems. They also had to balance the advice they received from formal councils with intelligence gathered through informal channels, personal observations, and their own analysis of situations. The most effective kings developed sophisticated methods for synthesizing information from multiple sources and testing their conclusions against reality. This brings us to something that shows just how mentally demanding medieval kingship really was: the incredible memory and organizational skills required to keep track of all the different responsibilities, relationships, and ongoing situations that required royal attention. Remember, medieval kings didn't have computers, filing systems, or even reliable paper records to help them manage information. They had to rely primarily on their personal memory and whatever organizational systems they could develop with their small staffs of clerks and scribes. But the amount of information they had to remember was absolutely staggering. They needed to keep track of the military capabilities, political loyalties, and personal characteristics of hundreds of nobles throughout their kingdoms. They had to remember the terms of dozens of treaties, trade agreements, and diplomatic commitments with foreign powers. They needed detailed knowledge of their kingdoms, economic resources, tax revenues, and financial obligations. They had to understand the legal precedents and customary rights that applied to different regions and social groups within their territory. Most challenging of all, they had to remember the complex web of personal relationships, family connections, and historical grievances that influenced political behavior throughout medieval Europe. Knowing that Lord A was the cousin of Duke B, who had a long-standing feud with Earl C, whose daughter was married to the son of King D, could be crucial information for understanding how different political situations might develop. Medieval kings developed sophisticated memory techniques and organizational systems that allowed them to manage this incredible information load. They used visual associations, narrative structures, and systematic review processes to ensure that important details weren't forgotten or confused. They also learned to delegate information management tasks to trusted advisors while still maintaining enough personal knowledge to evaluate the advice they received and make informed decisions. The most effective kings could switch rapidly between different topics and contexts, drawing on vast stores of accumulated knowledge to analyze complex problems and identify potential solutions. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of medieval royal information management was how kings learned to use incomplete and uncertain information to make decisions that had to be implemented immediately. They couldn't wait for perfect information or complete certainty before acting because delays could be just as dangerous as wrong decisions. This required developing what we might call strategic intuition, the ability to recognize patterns and make reasonable judgments based on limited evidence and previous experience. Medieval kings who survived and prospered were the ones who could quickly assess situations, identify the most likely scenarios, and choose courses of action that would be effective even if their initial assumptions turned out to be wrong. Now, let's dive into something that reveals the incredible physical and mental endurance required for medieval kingship. The actual daily schedule that these rulers maintained year after year, decade after decade, without any of the conveniences or support systems that modern leaders take for granted. A typical day for a medieval king would begin before dawn with personal prayers and briefings from advisors about overnight developments. By sunrise, he would already be conducting official business, hearing reports from messengers, and making decisions about urgent matters that couldn't wait for more formal consultations. The morning hours were usually devoted to administrative work that required the king's personal attention. This might include signing legal documents, reviewing financial reports, meeting with regional administrators, or hearing appeals from lower courts. Each of these tasks required careful attention and informed decision-making that could have significant consequences for the kingdom. Mid-morning typically brought the formal court sessions where the king would hear petitions from his subjects, resolve disputes between nobles, and conduct ceremonial functions that reinforced his authority and demonstrated royal justice. These sessions could last for hours and required intense concentration and diplomatic skill. Afternoon hours were often devoted to military affairs, whether that meant training with weapons, reviewing battle plans, inspecting fortifications, or meeting with military commanders about ongoing campaigns or potential threats. Even during peacetime, kings had to maintain their combat skills and stay informed about military developments. Evening brought diplomatic activities, including meetings with foreign ambassadors, discussions with important nobles about political matters, and social events that served important political functions. Medieval royal banquets weren't just parties. They were carefully orchestrated, political theater where alliances were strengthened, information was exchanged, and royal authority was displayed. But the day wasn't over when the formal schedule ended. Medieval kings often worked late into the night reading correspondence, planning future activities, and discussing sensitive matters with their closest advisors. They had to steal time for the kind of strategic thinking and long-term planning that couldn't happen during the hectic pace of daytime activities. And remember, this punishing schedule had to be maintained while traveling constantly, dealing with uncomfortable living conditions, and coping with the physical stress of medieval life. Kings couldn't take vacations, call in sick, or delegate their most important responsibilities to subordinates. The cumulative effect of maintaining this schedule for years or decades was enormous, physical and mental, where that aged medieval kings, far beyond their chronological years. Many died in their 40s or 50s from what we would now recognize as stress-related illnesses, exhaustion, or complications from injuries that never properly healed because they couldn't afford to rest. But the kings who survived this punishing lifestyle were the ones who learned to manage their energy efficiently, prioritized the most important tasks, and developed systems that allowed them to function effectively, even when they were tired, sick, or dealing with personal crisis. They understood that royal effectiveness wasn't just about making good decisions, but about maintaining the physical and mental capacity to keep making good decisions day after day, year after year, regardless of circumstances. This required a level of personal discipline and self-management that few modern leaders could match. The daily reality of medieval kingship was far more demanding than most people realize. These rulers were essentially running complex organizations, military operations, and political systems simultaneously while dealing with constant threats, physical hardships, and psychological pressures that would overwhelm most people. Yet, many of them not only survived these challenges, but actually accomplished remarkable things that shaped the course of history. They built institutions that lasted for centuries, created cultural achievements that we still admire today, and developed innovations in government, law, and diplomacy that influenced the development of a modern civilization. Understanding how they accomplished this requires recognizing that medieval kingship wasn't just about having power or authority. It was about using that power effectively to solve problems, protect people, and create lasting value, despite operating under constraints and pressures that were far more severe than anything faced by modern leaders. The most successful medieval kings were the ones who combined exceptional personal capabilities with sophisticated systems and strategies that allowed them to manage complexity, uncertainty, and constant pressure while still making decisions that served the long-term interests of their kingdoms and their people. Their legacies weren't built on accident or luck. They were the result of systematic approaches to leadership that maximized their effectiveness, despite operating under impossible constraints. And perhaps the most remarkable thing about these approaches is how they reveal the true nature of medieval political power. You see, we tend to think of medieval kings as having absolute authority, but the reality was completely different. Medieval royal power was actually incredibly fragmented and dependent on constant negotiation, persuasion, and relationship management. A king might theoretically own all the land in his kingdom, but in practice, he could only control the parts where he had enough military force, political support, and administrative capacity to enforce his will. This meant that medieval kings were constantly engaged in what we might call political entrepreneurship, finding creative ways to expand their influence and solve problems with limited resources. They couldn't just issue orders and expect them to be followed automatically. Instead, they had to convince, cajole, incentivize, and sometimes threaten people into cooperation. Consider how a medieval king had to handle something as basic as tax collection. He couldn't just send out government agents with legal authority to collect whatever taxes he wanted. Instead, he had to negotiate with local lords who controlled their own territories, bargain with merchant guilds who could disrupt trade, and maintain relationships with church officials who influenced public opinion about the legitimacy of royal demands. Each tax collection effort required a complex political campaign where the king had to justify his financial needs, demonstrate that the money would be used for legitimate purposes, and convince various groups that supporting royal taxation served their own interests. If he pushed too hard or too fast, he could trigger rebellions that would cost far more than the taxes could possibly raise. But successful medieval kings turned these constraints into opportunities by developing incredibly sophisticated political skills that allowed them to build coalitions, create win-win solutions, and achieve their objectives through influence rather than force. They learned to frame their requests in ways that appealed to different audiences, structured deals that gave everyone something they wanted, and build long-term relationships that made people want to support royal initiatives. This political Sophistication extended to how kings managed their own royal households and administrative systems. The royal court wasn't just a place where the king lived. It was a complex political ecosystem, where hundreds of people with different backgrounds, interests, and loyalties had to work together effectively. Managing this ecosystem required incredible skill in organizational psychology and human resource management. The king had to identify people with the right combination of competence and loyalty for different positions. He had to create incentive systems that motivated good performance while preventing corruption or disloyalty. He had to balance competing factions and personalities to prevent the kind of internal conflicts that could paralyze royal administration. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of managing the royal household was maintaining the delicate balance between accessibility and authority that was essential for effective medieval kingship. The king had to be approachable enough that people felt comfortable bringing him important information and honest advice. But he also had to maintain enough distance and formality to preserve the mystique and respect that made people willing to follow his leadership. Medieval kings who got this balance wrong usually didn't last very long. Kings who were too remote and formal found themselves isolated from crucial information and unable to build the personal relationships that held medieval political systems together. But kings who were too casual and familiar lost the awe and respect that made people willing to accept their authority and follow their commands. The most successful medieval kings mastered what we might call selective intimacy, the ability to create different types of relationships with different people based on their roles, capabilities, and importance to royal objectives. They could be warm and personal with trusted advisors, while remaining formal and distant with potential threats. They could show genuine care for loyal supporters, while maintaining cold professionalism toward political rivals. This emotional intelligence was crucial because medieval politics was intensely personal in ways that modern people often don't appreciate. Political alliances were based on personal trust, shared experiences, and emotional bonds that went far beyond simple calculations of mutual interest. Kings who couldn't inspire genuine loyalty and affection from their supporters found it very difficult to maintain power during crisis, when people had to choose between competing loyalties. But building these personal relationships required enormous emotional energy and psychological skill. Kings had to be genuinely interested in other people while still maintaining the emotional distance. Needed to make hard decisions that might hurt or disappoint those same people. They had to project warmth and caring while still being prepared to sacrifice individual relationships for broader political objectives. The psychological complexity of maintaining these multiple relationships simultaneously was staggering. A medieval king might have to console a grieving widow in the morning, negotiate a military alliance in the afternoon, and order the execution of a traitor in the evening, all while maintaining appropriate emotional responses that served his political objectives without appearing callous or manipulative. Now, let's talk about something that shows just how intellectually demanding medieval kingship really was: the king's role in what we would now call technological innovation and economic development. Because medieval kings weren't just managing existing systems and relationships, they were also responsible for identifying opportunities for improvement and implementing changes that could strengthen their kingdoms over time. This required them to understand and evaluate new technologies, economic strategies, and organizational innovations that were constantly emerging throughout medieval Europe. Kings had to assess whether new military technologies were worth the investment, whether new agricultural techniques could increase food production, whether new trade routes could generate additional revenue, and whether new administrative methods could improve government efficiency. But evaluating innovations wasn't just a matter of technical analysis. Kings also had to consider the political implications of change and figure out how to implement improvements without disrupting the delicate balance of relationships that kept their kingdoms functioning. New technologies that threatened established economic interests could trigger opposition from powerful groups. Administrative reforms that increased royal efficiency might be seen as threats to local autonomy and traditional rights. Medieval kings who succeeded at promoting innovation were the ones who learned to frame changes in ways that emphasize benefits for different stakeholders, rather than focusing on potential disruptions. They found ways to compensate people who might be hurt by changes, created transition periods that allowed gradual adaptation, and built coalitions of supporters who had incentives to help implement new approaches. This required incredible strategic thinking about how to sequence different types of changes, which groups to approach first, and how to build momentum for reform without triggering backlash from conservative factions. The most effective kings became masters of what we might call evolutionary change, finding ways to achieve dramatic improvements over time through carefully planned series of smaller adjustments that people could accept and adapt to gradually. But managing technological and economic innovation was just one aspect of the broader challenge of maintaining royal relevance in a constantly changing world. Medieval kings had to continuously adapt their approaches to leadership as circumstances evolved and new challenges emerged that required different skills and strategies. The kings who ruled successfully for decades were the ones who never stopped learning, experimenting, and refining their approaches to different aspects of governance. They studied the successes and failures of other rulers, analyzed changing political and economic conditions, and constantly looked for ways to improve their effectiveness as leaders. This intellectual curiosity and flexibility was crucial, because medieval Europe was far more dynamic and rapidly changing than most people realize. New military technologies constantly altered the balance of power between different types of forces. Changing trade patterns created new economic opportunities and challenges. Religious and philosophical developments influenced political thought and popular expectations about government. Kings who couldn't adapt to these changes found themselves increasingly irrelevant and vulnerable to challenges from more innovative rivals. But kings who embraced change and used it to strengthen their positions often found opportunities to expand their influence and achieve things that previous generations would have considered impossible. The most successful medieval kings were essentially lifelong learners who treated their reigns as ongoing experiments in leadership effectiveness. They were constantly testing new approaches, evaluating results, and adjusting their strategies based on what they learned from experience. This experimental approach to leadership required enormous intellectual humility and emotional resilience. Kings had to be willing to acknowledge when their initial approaches weren't working and change course without appearing weak or indecisive. They had to learn from failures without being paralyzed by fear of making mistakes. Most importantly, they had to maintain their confidence and authority while simultaneously remaining open to new ideas and willing to change their minds when presented with better information or more effective strategies. This balance between confidence and flexibility was one of the most challenging aspects of medieval royal leadership. But here's something that reveals just how sophisticated the most successful medieval kings really were. Their understanding of what we would now call systems thinking and their ability to see connections between different aspects of their kingdoms that might not be obvious to other people. Medieval kings, who excelled at their jobs, learned to think about their kingdoms as complex, interconnected systems where changes in one area could have unexpected consequences in completely different areas. They understood that military policies could affect economic development, that religious decisions could influence diplomatic relationships, and that administrative reforms could alter the balance of power between different social groups. This systems perspective allowed them to identify leverage points where relatively small interventions could produce large positive changes throughout their kingdoms. It also helped them anticipate unintended consequences of their decisions and plan strategies for managing the secondary effects of major policy changes. For example, a king who understood systems thinking might realize that investing in road construction wouldn't just improve military mobility, but would also facilitate trade, increase tax revenues, strengthen communication networks, and enhance royal authority in remote regions. He could design road-building projects that served multiple objectives simultaneously and created positive feedback loops that amplified the benefits of his initial investment. But systems thinking also revealed how complex and interconnected the challenges facing medieval kingdoms really were. Kings couldn't solve problems in isolation because every issue was connected to multiple other issues in ways that made simple solutions impossible. This complexity required medieval kings to develop what we might call strategic patience, the ability to work toward long-term objectives through coordinated efforts that might take years or even decades to achieve their full impact. They had to resist the temptation to look for quick fixes and instead invest in systematic approaches that addressed root causes rather than just symptoms. The most successful medieval kings were the ones who could balance this long-term strategic perspective with the immediate tactical flexibility needed to respond to crises and opportunities that couldn't wait for comprehensive solutions. They learned to work simultaneously on multiple time horizons, making decisions that served immediate needs while also advancing longer-term objectives. This multi-temporal thinking was one of the most intellectually demanding aspects of medieval kingship, requiring kings to constantly switch between different modes of analysis and decision-making, depending on the nature of the problems they were addressing. Now let's examine something that shows just how emotionally demanding medieval royal leadership really was: the incredible psychological burden of making decisions that affected not just current subjects, but future generations, who would live with the consequences of royal choices for decades or centuries to come. Medieval kings couldn't just focus on solving immediate problems and leave the future to take care of itself. They were responsible for making choices that would determine whether their kingdoms would be stronger or weaker, more prosperous or more impoverished, more stable or more chaotic, long after they were dead and gone. This long-term responsibility created enormous psychological pressure, because kings had to make decisions based on their best understanding of uncertain future developments, while knowing that they would never live to see whether their choices turned out to be wise or disastrous. Consider the emotional weight of deciding whether to invest royal resources in building new fortifications that might protect future generations from invasions that might never come, or whether to spend that money on immediate needs that could improve current conditions but leave the kingdom more vulnerable to future threats. These weren't abstract policy debates. They were moral dilemmas that forced kings to weigh the welfare of people who were alive and suffering now against the welfare of people who didn't exist yet, but who might face even worse suffering in the future if current decisions were wrong. The psychological complexity of these intergenerational trade-offs was staggering, especially because medieval kings often had very personal knowledge of the people who would be affected by their decisions. They might know the families who would benefit from immediate relief, and also understand the strategic importance of long-term investments that required sacrificing some current welfare for future security. Medieval kings who took their responsibilities to future generations seriously often found themselves making deeply unpopular decisions that were necessary for long-term benefit, but caused immediate hardship for people they cared about. They had to live with the knowledge that their choices were causing real suffering for real people, even when they believed those choices were ultimately for the greater good. But perhaps the most psychologically demanding aspect of this intergenerational responsibility was the uncertainty about whether their long-term judgments would turn out to be correct. Kings had to make irreversible decisions based on their analysis of future possibilities that might never materialize or might develop in completely unexpected ways. Successful medieval kings were the ones who found ways to cope with this uncertainty, while still making the hard choices required for effective long-term leadership. They developed what we might call strategic wisdom, the ability to make the best possible decisions with incomplete information, while accepting that some of their choices would inevitably turn out to be wrong. They learned to focus on making decisions that would be defensible, regardless of how uncertain future developments unfolded, rather than trying to predict specific outcomes that might never occur. They looked for strategies that would create flexibility and options for future rulers, rather than locking their kingdoms into rigid approaches that might become obsolete. Most importantly, they understood that their responsibility wasn't to make perfect decisions, but to make the best decisions possible, given the information and resources available to them. They learned to accept the tragic reality that leadership sometimes requires choosing between different types of suffering, rather than finding perfect solutions that avoid all negative consequences. This psychological maturity was essential for effective medieval kingship, because the emotional burden of royal responsibility could easily become overwhelming for people who expected themselves to solve every problem and prevent every form of suffering. Kings who couldn't accept the limitations of their power and the inevitability of tragic trade-offs often became paralyzed by guilt and indecision, or driven to increasingly desperate and counterproductive attempts to control outcomes. that were fundamentally beyond their control. The daily reality of medieval kingship was an extraordinary test of human capability that combined intellectual, physical, emotional, and moral challenges that would overwhelm most people. Yet, the most successful medieval kings not only survived these challenges, but actually used them to develop remarkable capabilities and achieve lasting accomplishments that shaped the course of history. Understanding their achievements requires recognizing that medieval kingship wasn't just about having power or authority, but about developing and applying exceptional human capabilities under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. These rulers became masters of strategic thinking, relationship management, decision-making under uncertainty, and adaptive leadership that allowed them to function effectively in one of the most demanding roles in human history. Their legacies remind us that individual human capability, when properly developed and applied, can overcome seemingly impossible obstacles and create positive change, even in the most challenging circumstances. The daily lives of medieval kings show us what human beings can accomplish when they fully commit themselves to serving purposes larger than their own immediate interests and comfort. But there's one final aspect of medieval kingship that ties together everything we've discussed and reveals why these rulers were so remarkable. Their understanding that true leadership isn't about controlling outcomes, but about maximizing the positive impact you can have within the constraints and opportunities that define your historical moment. Medieval kings operated under severe limitations that would frustrate modern leaders accustomed to advanced technology, sophisticated institutions, and relatively stable political systems. They had to work with primitive communication systems, limited economic resources, fragmented political authority, and constant threats that could destroy everything they built. But the most successful medieval kings didn't waste energy complaining about these constraints or waiting for better conditions that might never come. Instead, they focused on identifying opportunities for positive impact within their existing circumstances and developing the capabilities needed to make the most of those opportunities. They understood that leadership effectiveness isn't measured by the absence of problems or the elimination of all suffering, but by the positive difference you make compared to what would have happened without your efforts. They learned to find satisfaction and meaning in incremental progress rather than expecting perfect solutions to complex problems. This perspective allowed them to maintain the motivation and energy needed for sustained effort over decades of challenging leadership, while avoiding the burnout and disillusionment that could result from unrealistic expectations about what individual leaders can accomplish. The most remarkable medieval kings were the ones who combined exceptional personal capabilities with realistic understanding of their limitations and systematic approaches to maximizing their positive impact within those limitations. They show us what becomes possible when human beings fully commit themselves to serving others, while developing the skills and wisdom needed to be effective in that service. Their daily lives were extraordinary demonstrations of human potential that continue to inspire and challenge us centuries later. Understanding what they accomplished and how they accomplished it provides valuable insights into the nature of leadership, the possibilities of human development, and the potential for individual impact on the course of history. The most important lesson we can learn from studying the daily lives of medieval kings is something that will completely change how you think about leadership, power, and human potential. These weren't just historical figures who lived in a different time with different challenges. They were human beings who faced problems that were fundamentally similar to the ones we deal with today, just without any of the tools and resources we take for granted. Think about it this way. Every medieval king had to figure out how to motivate people who didn't want to do what he needed them to do. They had to make complex decisions with incomplete information while dealing with competing pressures from different groups. They had to build and maintain relationships with people who had their own agendas and interests. They had to manage their time and energy across multiple demanding responsibilities while dealing with stress, uncertainty, and the constant possibility of failure. Sound familiar? These are exactly the same challenges facing modern leaders, entrepreneurs, managers, and anyone who wants to make a positive impact in their community or organization. The specific details might be different, but the underlying human dynamics are remarkably similar. But here's what makes medieval kings so inspiring and instructive for us today. They had to solve these universal leadership challenges without any of the advantages we have access to. No instant communication, no data analytics, no professional training programs, no management consultants, no psychological research about motivation and decision. They had to figure everything out through trial and error, learning from their mistakes and developing their own systems and strategies based on whatever resources they could find. And the most successful ones didn't just survive these challenges. They actually thrived and created lasting positive change that influenced the development of entire civilizations. What this tells us is that the fundamental capabilities required for effective leadership aren't dependent on having access to modern technology or sophisticated institutional support. They're about developing core human skills like strategic thinking, emotional intelligence, relationship building, decision under pressure, and the ability to inspire others to work towards shared objectives. Medieval kings proved that these capabilities can be developed by anyone who is willing to put in the effort to learn and practice them consistently over time. They show us that individual human potential is far greater than most people realize, and that extraordinary achievements are possible even under extremely difficult circumstances. But they also reveal something crucial about what it takes to develop that potential. Medieval kings who succeeded weren't just naturally gifted individuals who happened to be born with superior abilities. They were people who committed themselves to continuous learning and improvement throughout their entire careers. They studied constantly, experimented with different approaches, learned from their failures, and never stopped trying to get better at the various skills required for effective leadership. They understood that developing exceptional capabilities requires sustained efforts over many years, not just innate talent or lucky circumstances. This is perhaps the most important insight we can gain from studying medieval kingship. Excellence in any demanding field requires the same kind of systematic approach to skill development, the same willingness to embrace challenges and learn from setbacks, and the same commitment to serving purposes larger than your own immediate comfort and convenience. Whether you're running a business, leading a team, raising a family, or trying to make a positive difference in your community, the lessons from medieval kingship are directly applicable to your situation. The specific tactics and strategies might need to be adapted to modern circumstances, but the underlying principles of effective leadership remain constant across time periods and cultures. The daily lives of medieval kings show us what becomes possible when human beings fully commit themselves to developing their capabilities and using those capabilities in service of others. They remind us that individual actions and decisions can have enormous positive impact even when operating under severe constraints and facing seemingly impossible challenges. But perhaps most importantly, they demonstrate that the most meaningful and fulfilling way to live is to find purposes worth serving that are larger than your own immediate interests, and then to develop whatever capabilities are needed to serve those purposes as effectively as possible. The next time you're facing a difficult decision, dealing with competing pressures, or wondering whether you have what it takes to handle a challenging responsibility, remember that medieval kings dealt with similar problems every single day for decades at a time. They found ways to function effectively, make good decisions, and create positive change despite operating under conditions that were far more difficult than anything most of us will ever face. Their example shows us that human beings are capable of far more than we typically expect of ourselves. The question isn't whether you have the potential to handle difficult challenges and make a positive difference in the world. The question is whether you're willing to commit yourself to developing that potential and using it in service of something meaningful. Medieval kings weren't superhuman. They were ordinary people who chose to accept extraordinary responsibilities, and then did whatever it took to fulfill those responsibilities effectively. They show us that the same choice is available to all of us, and that the same potential for positive impact exists in every human life. The truth is, when you really dig into what medieval kings accomplished on a daily basis, it becomes impossible to see them as anything other than some of the most capable and dedicated leaders in human history. These weren't people who stumbled into power and then coasted on their privileges. They were individuals who understood that true leadership means accepting responsibility for outcomes that extend far beyond your own lifetime, and then doing whatever it takes to ensure those outcomes are positive. But here's what might surprise you most about everything we've covered today. The story of medieval kingship isn't really about kings at all. It's about what becomes possible when human beings decide to fully commit themselves to serving something larger than their own immediate comfort and convenience. It's about the extraordinary capabilities that emerge when people are willing to embrace challenges that seem impossible, and then systematically develop whatever skills are needed to overcome those challenges. Every single aspect of medieval royal life that we've explored, from the crushing daily schedule to the life and death decision, to the constant pressure of managing complex relationships, reveals fundamental truths about human potential that apply just as much today as they did 1,000 years ago. Think about the medieval king who had to wake up before dawn every morning for decades, knowing that each day would bring dozens of problems that could destroy everything he'd built if handled incorrectly. He couldn't call in sick, couldn't delegate. The most important decisions couldn't take breaks when things got overwhelming. He had to show up every single day and perform at the highest level, regardless of how he felt or what personal challenges he was facing. That kind of sustained excellence under pressure isn't something you're born with. It's something you develop through years of deliberate practice, continuous learning, and an unwavering commitment to getting better at handling whatever challenges come your way. And the remarkable thing is that this same capacity for sustained high performance exists in every one of us, waiting to be developed if we're willing to put in the work. Consider the diplomatic skills that successful medieval kings had to master. They couldn't just bulldoze their way through complex political situations or rely on their formal authority to solve every problem. Instead, they had to become incredibly sophisticated at reading people, understanding different perspectives, finding common ground between competing interests, and building coalitions that could accomplish shared objectives. These are exactly the same skills that determine success in modern leadership roles. Whether you're managing a team at work, building a business, or trying to create positive change in your community, the specific context might be different, but the underlying human dynamics are identical. What medieval kingship teaches us is that these capabilities can be developed to an extraordinary degree if you approach them with the right mindset and methodology. Medieval kings who succeeded weren't naturally gifted diplomats who never had to work at building relationships. They were people who understood that effective leadership requires constant attention to how you interact with others and continuous improvement in your ability to inspire cooperation and build trust. The same principle applies to every other aspect of medieval royal leadership. We've discussed the strategic thinking, the decision under pressure, the ability to manage multiple complex responsibilities simultaneously, the emotional resilience needed to handle constant stress and uncertainty. None of these are fixed traits that some people have and others don't. They're all skills that can be developed through focused effort and systematic practice. But perhaps the most important lesson from medieval kingship is something that goes beyond individual skill development. It's the recognition that the most meaningful and fulfilling way to live is to find purposes worth serving that extend beyond your own immediate interests, and then to commit yourself completely to serving those purposes as effectively as possible. Medieval kings who left lasting positive legacies weren't primarily motivated by personal ambition or the desire for power and wealth. They were driven by a deep sense of responsibility to their people, their kingdoms, and future generations, who would inherit whatever they built or failed to build. This sense of purpose gave them the motivation to endure incredible hardships and maintain peak performance over decades of challenging leadership. The same source of motivation is available to all of us. Whether your sphere of influence includes thousands of people or just your own family, whether you're responsible for a major organization or a small team, the opportunity to make a positive difference in other people's lives is always present. And when you fully embrace that opportunity, it transforms not just what you accomplish, but who you become in the process. Medieval kings show us that ordinary human beings can achieve extraordinary things when they combine exceptional skill development with a genuine commitment to serving others. They prove that individual actions and decisions can have enormous positive impact even when operating under severe constraints and facing seemingly impossible challenges. But they also remind us that this level of impact requires a level of commitment that most people aren't willing to make. It means accepting responsibility for outcomes that extend far beyond your own immediate circumstances. It means developing capabilities that take years to master, and maintaining peak performance, even when you don't feel like it. It means making decisions based on what's best for others, not just what's convenient for you. The daily life of a medieval king was essentially a decadacial, long demonstration of what becomes possible when someone decides to live according to these principles. And the remarkable thing is that the same choice is available to every one of us, regardless of our circumstances or current capabilities. You don't need to be born into royalty or have access to vast resources to make a meaningful difference in the world. You just need to be willing to identify purposes worth serving. Commit yourself to developing whatever capabilities are needed to serve those purposes effectively, and then show up every day and do the work. Regardless of how you feel or what obstacles you encounter, medieval kings prove that this approach to life works. They show us that individual human potential is far greater than most people realize, and that extraordinary achievements are possible when you combine systematic skill development with unwavering commitment to serving others. Their legacies continue to inspire and challenge us centuries later because they represent the best of what human beings can accomplish. When they fully commit themselves to purposes larger than their own immediate comfort and convenience, they remind us that we all have the same potential for positive impact, and that the only question is whether we're willing to develop and use that potential in service of something meaningful. So the next time you're wondering whether you have what it takes to handle a challenging responsibility or make a real difference in the world, remember the medieval kings who faced similar challenges every single day for decades at a time. They weren't superhuman. They were ordinary people who made extraordinary commitments and then did whatever it took to fulfill those commitments effectively. The same opportunity exists for all of us. The same potential for positive impact is waiting to be developed and expressed through our own choices and actions. The only question is whether we're ready to embrace that opportunity and commit ourselves to becoming the kind of people who can make the most of it. That's the real lesson of medieval kingship. It's tempting to imagine that once a medieval king had mastered the daily grind, the endless responsibilities, the diplomacy, the judgments, the grinding ritual of never being wrong in public, he could then relax into a kind of confident rhythm, like a blacksmith who no longer flinches at the heat. But no, that would have been far too convenient, because just as soon as he began to feel some small semblance of order in his kingdom, perhaps his vassals had stopped feuding for a week, or the tax collectors hadn't been assassinated on the road. This month, that's exactly when fate would tap him on the shoulder and whisper, "Did you think it would be that easy?" New crises always arrived, as if summoned by the very act of relief. A blight on the grain harvest. A minor noble raising a banner in rebellion after being snubbed. At court, a bishop quietly implying in Latin that the king's soul might be in danger. Or a letter from a neighboring realm inviting him to discuss matters of mutual concern, which everyone knew was code for "we're about to invade your southern border." In such moments, the king couldn't retreat into reflection or spiritual retreat. He had to respond immediately, visibly, and in a way that reassured his subjects. He was still the unmoving rock in the middle of the storm. You, sitting quietly in your bed, might think you're good under pressure. But a medieval king was expected to exude certainty in situations where no right answer existed. If he overreacted to a rumor, he might plunge the kingdom into unnecessary war. If he underreacted, he might wake up one morning to find his capital under siege. And yet, decisions had to be made now. So he became the kind of man who made decisions, not with the clarity of perfect knowledge, but with the precision of deeply practiced instinct. He would weigh the loyalty of dukes, the implications of alliances, the seasonal readiness of roads, and even the mood of the common folk, who had a tendency to revolt when both taxes and sermons got too long. That constant balancing act shaped the king into something that was part leader, part juggler, and part gambler. But he gambled not with coins, he gambled with generations. Every move he made might ripple outward to affect grandchildren he'd never meet. And so, though his clothes were heavy and his words carefully measured, his mind raced constantly through possibilities, like a man trying to play chess while riding a galloping horse. The sheer mental load of it would buckle the average person within a week, but medieval kings didn't have that luxury. They had to look unbothered while orchestrating 1,000 hidden battles, not just of armies, but of wills, ambitions, egos, and secrets. Because if the king showed fear just once, that fear would metastasize throughout his kingdom. Confidence then became a royal performance art. It had to be performed daily, like prayer or bread baking. That's why the throne was always elevated, the robes exaggerated, the language ritualized, not because kings were arrogant, but because every visual cue reminded the court that this was not a man like any other. This was stability incarnate. But of course, inside the royal skull, behind the polished eyes and formal decrees, the man himself often wrestled with private panic. He'd think of how close everything teetered on collapse. How one miscalculation, one delay, one traitor's whisper could undo a decade's worth of careful rule. The knowledge of fragility never left him. Yet he had to pretend he didn't see it. Because a king's strength wasn't just in swords or seals. It was in illusion. The illusion that order was permanent, that justice was inevitable, that the realm would not fracture simply because its architect had a bad week. And so he carried on adjusting laws in the morning, mediating baronial squabbles in the afternoon, and reviewing fortress walls by torchlight at night. He became, by necessity, the kind of person who functioned not with rest, but with momentum. The days blurred, the faces changed, and the crises kept coming. And you, centuries later, might lie comfortably under a soft blanket, thinking leadership means giving a TED talk and answering emails. But in the medieval world, it meant never flinching while walking across a tightrope made of spears, with the entire nation balanced on your shoulders. You weren't born to do it. You became it, or you failed. And failure didn't just cost your pride. It cost lives, legacies, and the very idea that something good could be built in the chaos.